because John doesn't mention it, excuse me, it's unfair to say because Matthew or Mark or Luke doesn't mention this, it didn't happen. We have 4 different people giving accounts of the same thing. If we all see something, let's say we see a car accident down the road.
We're all going to vary.
Let's say I say in my account that I heard the brakes screech, I heard a woman scream, and then bang. And then Kay says that I heard a woman scream, and then brakes, and then bang. It's the exact same message said in a different order, but it still happened. Just because there's differences slightly, it's not right to say therefore nothing happens.
But say I said, okay, let's go with that analogy. Okay, let's go with that analogy. So it's a car crash and so on. This chap here says an alien spaceship came down and the aliens got out and kidnapped someone and went up to heaven again. Now, so we all 3 agree, I don't know, it was a car crash. He says it was some alien from heaven that came down to Earth and did his stuff. Now, are you going to say just 3 different areas? I mean, are you going to believe this guy?
And then
Really? But you see how different the accounts are. In John's Gospel, Jesus comes from heaven, unlike in Matthew, Mark and Luke. He says stuff that no one else has ever heard him say in Matthew, Mark and Luke, or Paul, or Acts, or anywhere else. And you're supposed to say it's just like seeing a car crash, but it's like him seeing an alien ship coming down from Mars.
So what
and it's just the same. It's not the same. You can't say they're all just a different perspective because you have not seen a spaceship, have you? You've not seen a spaceship. I've not seen a spaceship.
No, you don't know that.
So what about if a completely...
It's a story. It's not meant to be taken literally.
So what if a new gospel comes along, for example, maybe 600 years later, and ascribes words to Christ that weren't in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Then we could use Paul's argument to say, how did anyone miss it?
Ho, ho, ho. Ho, ho, ho.
He had spoken from the cradle and absolutely no one, including Mary, heard him.
At the end of John's Gospel, even in John it says there are many other things. Even in John.
That's what I was arguing a minute ago.
Even in John, I'm endorsing John here. I'm giving you something. Even in John it says Jesus did many other things. They ought to be written down. The books of the world can contain it. Now, it just so happens that God revealed his final revelation, which was revealed to Prophet Muhammad 600 years later, the exact truth of what did and didn't happen to Jesus, including some of those stories that even John says were not written down, that God knew about. So the fact that it's not in the Gospels does not mean it's not true.
Do you not see why we have...
Coming back to John.
Sorry, but do you not see why we have an issue with Muhammad's revelation? Because imagine if somebody...
why is that?
Imagine if
the
somebody...
law and the prophets, and then Christ.
Imagine if somebody said, Luke chapter 16, the law and the prophets were until John. But going to my point, if somebody from France come along 1,000 years after Muhammad...
France?
Yeah, let's just say, if somebody from France...
You've lost me now.
Come along 1,000 years after...
When did France come into this?
No, it's a valid point. If somebody comes along in France 1,000 years later and says, I am the final messenger of God, and Muhammad wasn't the final messenger, all that stuff he said, ignore that. It never happened. I am the final messenger. Do you not see why I mean, you would reject that. And all I'm saying,
actually, I wouldn't. No, I actually believe it to be true, because the Quran claims, and I think with some justification, not to be giving a new message. What it's saying is over and over again, it's repeating and confirming the original revelation given to Jesus, Moses, etc. Now, when I look at this historically, when I look at the little knowledge I have, what little knowledge I've gained from studying this academically, I see what the Quran's getting at. Because if for example, what's the most important single, the top message in the Quran that keeps on repeating endlessly? Tawheed. This is
just a warner. He has no sign.
No. It's nothing to do with Muhammad. Muhammad gets mentioned about 4 times in the Quran.
No way.
Coming back to the Tawheed, you're absolutely right. Now, the idea of the oneness of God. Jesus was asked, according to Mark's Gospel, what is the most important commandment? Jesus was asked this according to your own Gospel. And what did he say in Mark? No, he said, "Hero is the Shema." The Shema, which is Hebrew for hear. Hang on, no, you're jumping one.
These 2 are the greatest.
Wrong answer.
So he said it's not the wrong answer.
Let me give the answer.
I'm paraphrasing it.
Hey, excuse me.
No, you did ask.
Did I? That's fair enough. Okay, all right, okay. It was a rhetorical question. My bad. It was a rhetorical question. He said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." He quoted the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord, and you shall love him with all your heart, mind." But before the love bit, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." This is Tawheed. So the top commandment according to Jesus, the top commandment according to the Quran, is the same commandment. Isn't that interesting? It's not a new revelation of the Quran, it's the same. So what's the second most important commandment according to the Quran? We'll go through this. What's the second most important?
To the Quran?
Yeah.
Enlighten me.
Huh?
Enlighten me.
Oh, really? Have you read the Quran? No. It's that we must not associate partners or intermediaries with God. If you look at the earliest historical data we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Q, M and L, to get academic for a second, Jesus is portrayed as someone who proclaims God, not himself. He proclaims God and his kingdom that is to come. If we look at the later Christian religion, the proclaimer has become the proclaimed. The proclaimer has become the one who is proclaimed. There's been an inversion of the religion of Jesus. What does the Quran do? It says, proclaim God and acknowledge and listen to his messengers. This is pretty much like what Jesus was about in the earliest historical records we have. So on these two top things, the Quran, the Tawheed and the Shirk issue, which in Arabic, you're right, Jesus and the Quran are agreement. Everything else is secondary to that. And I think that's a really great foundation for a religion. What has Christianity done? It associates partners with God. It says, worship God the Father and worship Jesus. But Jesus didn't say worship me, he said worship God. So you've lost Tawheed and you committed Shirk. So Islam is not a new religion, it's an old religion being spruced up, cleansed of its corruptions, and saying, look, this is what you should believe, the religion of Abraham. That's what the Quran says. Follow the religion of Abraham.
So I would say that Muhammad definitely did change the prior revelation, because you have.
Can you give an example?
Let's bear. I will give you an example. Yeah. So let's bear this in mind. You have the eyewitnesses, the Matthew, John, etc.
Eyewitnesses.
Matthew, John, yes.
Wow.
So John claims to be an eyewitness in the very end.
Matthew does.
Chapter 21. John claims to be an eyewitness. So
doesn't mention John.
Let me carry on. So you have these eyewitnesses, these people who saw Jesus. John chapter 19. You have 4 witnesses there at the cross. You see him.
What do I do with it?
You then have these people. You then have Muhammad come along 600 or so years after, saying none of this ever happened. If let's say this is in a court.
No, what happened? I missed the.
You have Muhammad come along 600 years after.
Deny what happened?
Denying that the crucifixion happened.
I see. Right.
Killed him or crucified him.
Yeah.
So you have that. So he definitely did change the message that the eyewitnesses, who claim to be eyewitnesses, said they saw.
Yeah.
But also Muhammad, I mean, you believe he's a messenger in the line of prophets like Moses, etc.
Of course.
He actually did contradict Moses. For example, in Leviticus chapter 26 verse 1, it says you should not have any sacred stones. We know in the Kaaba you have a sacred stone. In one of the hadiths it says that Muhammad kissed this stone, and one of his companions said, unless I saw if I didn't see Muhammad doing this, I wouldn't do it, because I know it's just a stone.
What happened to you? I'm sorry.
I know it's just a stone, etc., etc. So here you see Islam. You have a sacred stone as such. You have Muhammad kissing the stone, but Moses said you shan't have any sacred stones. So I would say that he did change the message slightly there, definitely.
Okay. Well, firstly,
eyewitnesses, please address that part.
Yeah, I'll address it in the order that he mentioned it.
I'm not the eyewitnesses first.
Yes.
Yeah. All right,
is that all right?
Yes, it's fine.
With your permission, I will address his question.
You will, yeah.
It's very kind of you. I don't know any scholar who thinks, by scholar I mean historians, properly accredited historians at major universities in the West. I don't know anyone who thinks the 4 Gospels are written by eyewitnesses. I mean, no one does. And there are good reasons for this. This debate has been had 200 years ago. You're a bit behind the times when it comes to scholarship on this.
I was alive at the time.
I was. I remember in 1783, when I was a mere 18-year-old. How old are you?
Be nice.
I'm old enough to know better than answering that question.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Pots and kettles. Oh, that's a bit rude, isn't
ladies,
it?
their ages.
This is true.
Then assuming gender, so.
Oh, of course, you're actually a male teenager.
Well, no, I'm just a product of this society, unfortunately.
Anyway, sorry, just a very. You're very witty too. Very quickly, let's take the first Gospel, Matthew. It doesn't claim to be eyewitness. It doesn't say it's written by Matthew. It's written in the third person, so it talks about. It's not written in the first person. I saw Jesus do that. It's written in the third person. So there's not even an internal evidence that Matthew wrote it. The earliest claim that it was written by Matthew, as you mentioned, was Irenaeus, but he was writing towards 180, 190 AD, long after. When the Gospel is quoted by earlier writers like Justin Martyr and Ignatius of Antioch, is never quoted as from the Gospel of Matthew. They're just sayings which may not have even been put in the Gospel at that time. Luke doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. He says he relies on other people. Mark doesn't claim to be an eyewitness either. And Matthew and Luke use Mark in the writing of their own Gospel, by the way. We now know this. We can see that, which is a bit odd if you're an eyewitness. Why would you use someone else's work? Hey, John's Gospel doesn't actually name John or Johann or anything like that in the Gospel. It talks about the disciples Jesus loved. It doesn't name him. We have no idea who this dude was. We don't know his name, address, telephone number. We don't know his email address. We don't know his WhatsApp. Nothing.
We can at least say that.
Did they have email at the time?
We've got the
Well, but
WhatsApp.
by him saying this is the disciple who testifies to these things, and we know his testimony is true. By saying that, whether it's John or not, we can at least say yes, it is a disciple.
Right.
And then we go to the external writings to show that this is in fact John.
Right. There are no external writings in the first century that it's by John.
Irenaeus says it.
Yeah, but you see, Irenaeus. Do you know Irenaeus' biography? Do you know who this guy was? Irenaeus lived in Lyon, what we now call Lyon, in France. Yeah, well, there wasn't. France didn't exist then. Part of the Roman Empire, he lived in Lyon in France. He didn't hang around Judea. He didn't know these guys. He lived 1,000 miles. No, hang on. He didn't know the apostles. He didn't know Matthew because he lived in a different century. He lived towards the end of the second century.
Yeah, and Polycarp was his mentor. John was Polycarp's mentor.
See, this is all very, very tenuous. It's not a strong argument.
Yeah, but what we have here, we have somebody who's a disciple of John who taught Irenaeus, and that's the closest you can possibly get. But even though we have that, you're still saying no, that can't be right.
Who wrote the Quran?
No, I'm not.
Who wrote the Quran? Because we don't know the guy's name, the WhatsApp, the Instagram page. We just don't know who wrote it. We've got scrappings
know
of
who inscribed the
bone,
names.
animal skins.
I like this lady. She copies my rhetoric there.
So was it Uthman?
By the way, that was actually trademarked. You can't quote it without my permission.
Shucks.
So I would expect. I expect
Is it a level playing field?
royalties from
women
quoting.
division, that kind of thing.
Well, in some cases, yes.
So do you know when these names were ascribed to this?
And I didn't mean you, by the way. I was
You're
thinking.
assuming gender if you do.
Well, indeed, because I know you're actually a black teenage man,
With one
not a
leg.
white
With one
woman.
leg.
Because hey, you could be.
Yeah.
What are we talking about? Anyway, let me get back to the point. If you look at the first century, that Matthew itself doesn't claim to be eyewitness. It's in third person. The other reason is the disciples. Sorry to be rude, but this is a technical term. Were peasants.
No, not all.
They were fishermen. These guys didn't go to university and get degrees in anything. There was no education. They couldn't read. They couldn't write. Hang on. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written in very good Greek. Not the language that they would have spoken. They certainly wouldn't have written it because they couldn't read and write, because they were peasants, they were fishermen. So the whole thing suggests what the consensus of historians is that they are second generation Christians, Gentile Christians, with the exception perhaps of Matthew, who's probably a Jewish Christian, but not the original disciples. No one, to my knowledge, believes they were written by, even evangelicals who are scholars don't believe that. So your argument in that sense falls, in my view, because there's no evidence for it.
Can I ask that one point?
Oh, yeah, okay.
You say that they're peasants, they're illiterate, can't read or can't write.
It sounds very judgmental, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean that in
Let me speak. But let's just bear this. Let's just bear this in mind.
True.
Let's just bear this in mind. The Gospels, as we know, were written some years after.
Yeah.
And illiteracy is in fact a curable disease. If they want to pen this down
What's
at some
it,
point
disease?
later, they can very well learn to read and write in that
really?
time span.
Right.
Of course they could. Yeah, no issue. And we know that Luke.
They went to school, did they?
We know that Luke, for example, Luke's Gospel is a high Greek, as you say. Also, we can see from Luke's, Luke is called a physician in other parts of the New Testament. So, being a physician, he would have been well educated.
Oh.
So, to say none of them could read or write, I don't think that's correct.
I'm not talking about Luke. I was talking about the disciples. Luke was not a disciple of Jesus.
This is a valid point. I mean, for example,
Luke was not a disciple. You're mixing it up here.
But you bear in mind, no, I'm not. But you bear in mind, Luke said that he took into account all the eyewitness accounts. But Peter, as the gentleman rightly said,
What is your name?
George.
Peter, as we
I
see
am
Peter's
Fred.
as we see in chapter 5 of I think it's 1 or 2 Peter, Peter says that he makes the claim that Silvanus wrote this letter for him in a sense. So there's no issue there with, for example, Peter using Silvanus to write for him, and in no way is, I mean, for example, we know Mark wrote for Peter, so there's no issue there. If Peter can't write, Mark did for him.
The issue is illiterate Galilean peasants
Mohammed didn't
could
read
not
and
have
write.
written a sophisticated bit of literature in Greek. They wouldn't have gone off to Galilee University to learn Greek. Do you know what percentage? You either know or you don't. It's estimated the percentage of the people in the Roman Empire that could read and write, because they were separate things, was 2%. They were the absolute elite who could read and write. I do not believe Galilean fishermen suddenly became part of that 2% elite and managed to produce. No, but you see,
signs and wonders. They did have the power of God with them.
there's no evidence that they dictated it
Injil
either.
was revealed by Allah, so you must believe that they had signs and wonders around them, that they had the power of the Holy Spirit or whatever, the power of the Father. Yeah, I'm over here, darling.
I thought it was you.
Excuse me.
But Jesus many times he calls them your dull. That means even when he talks with them
he says you're
in
dull.
parable,
Chapter and verse.
he tells them.
Sorry,
he tells,
chapter and verse.
I will go to the chapter. I will give
Give us the chapter and verse.
Jesus himself talked to his disciple and he calls them dull.
Dull.
That,
I've read the
that they
Bible.
don't get
You've read the
the
Bible. Do you
parable.
remember that
the
bit?
No
parable.
comment.
Is it abrogated? Is it missing?
Chapter and verse, please.
I don't know.
Anyway,
Times.
the evidence suggests to virtually all historians in the world, including biblical scholars who are Christians, that the four Gospels are not written by eyewitnesses because there's no evidence that they were. And this matters. John, as virtually all his scholars have already said, because of the problems in understanding why Jesus, if he'd gone around making these amazing statements about himself, I am this, I am that, in public, why would no other historical source in the first century know about this? And the argument is that John, because he believes Jesus is the light of the world, he puts those words in Jesus' mouth. So if you just had changed the pronoun, you could almost say, you are the light of the world. That's what John is trying to say. Now,
So there are accounts of contemporary accounts of satirists making fun of Christians shortly after the resurrection by saying,
what accounts?
Satirists.
I know what satirists are.
Yeah.
What accounts are these?
I'll try and find them, but if I can say it first and then try and find them, because I read it. So of making fun of people because they thought they saw a dead man risen, etc. So those would be extra scriptural.
Not from the first century that I'm aware. Not from the first century.
Well, even if it was early second century, it would still
No, but you
be
said from that
years.
you said from that time.
Okay, well, that is that time.
I don't deny later on people made Mickey out of that.
Okay, so why would people be willing to be tortured and killed for something that they secretly knew wasn't true?
What was it they knew was secretly true?
So no. They publicly declared that Christ had risen,
I
that
see.
he was the living God. But so, for example, Watergate, those people couldn't keep a lie for a couple of years under questioning, but these disciples could keep this truth going.
Let me respond. This apparently is a good point. So all these early Christians, I said apparently. So the clue lies in the word apparent.
I got it.
I'm about to go in and. It's apparently a good point that the early Christians, they proclaimed Jesus' resurrection, death and resurrection, and they were killed. And why would they die as martyrs for something they didn't believe in? Yeah, God, that's a good argument. Well, it isn't, unfortunately. There's a book.
I can tell you're devastated.
I am inwardly weeping. I just can't help myself. There's a recent book out by an eminent historian of the early church, Christine Moss. She's a professor in the States, and she advances the argument saying there's actually no evidence at all that the earliest disciples in the first century were martyred at all.
What about Stephen?
No, hang on. Good one.
Looking for that verse and it's disappeared.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe he's gone to look for it over there. The verse is over there. Stephen was not one of Jesus' disciples, first of all, was he? He's not one of the 12.
He was the first martyr.
And yes, he was. But the reason given, what was the reason given in the book of Acts for Stephen's own martyrdom? What's the reason given?
Dissent, like disagreement with the council that tried him.
Okay, there's a long rambling speech that purports to be Stephen attacking the Sanhedrin, and he gets more and more abusive, and he accuses them of this and he accuses them of that, and he says you're stiff-necked and you're this and you're that, and he pisses them off to such an extent that he gets into trouble in that way. He's not being executed because the Pharisees, as the council made clear, the Pharisees also believed in the resurrection of the dead. Believing in the resurrection of the dead is not un-Jewish. It's not an un-Jewish thing. You can believe that and be a good Orthodox Jew. There's nothing wrong in believing that. So Stephen wasn't executed for saying Jesus rose from the dead. He was executed for being abusive. We can read it all in Acts. So that example doesn't work either. There's no historical evidence that any of Jesus' disciples were killed or executed for saying that Jesus rose from the dead. That is a later Christian myth, which I hear all the time at Speaker's Corner and elsewhere.
You're the only person decrying them as a myth.
You say
no.
That's because I'm the only one that's read the evidence.
For a second.
you say Stephen
The evidence of one American.
Is this yours, by the way?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I was about to pick it. I'll just move that side
You
there.
say, you say Stephen was put to death for insults, and then not for his belief in Jesus. Well,
Jesus' resurrection from the dead.
this is what he says here.
Yeah.
Verse 55 in chapter 7. But being full of the Holy Spirit, he gazed intently into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God.
Yeah.
And he said, behold, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice, and then they went on to kill him. So before he died, right before he died, he said he saw Jesus in heaven. And then they killed him for that, not for the insults. They only kicked off after he saw Jesus in heaven.
Just on that very passage, what did he see in heaven?
The Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Father.
No, with respect, can you read it again?
God, you like that?
Don't ruin my lines. Don't listen to this man.
Please, no.
Can you read again what you just told me? Because you have done the classic Christian double switch twisting.